people don't want to watch a documentary about cancer and about Cancer Alley, but they'll watch a documentary about surfing. And surfing really is the first domino in that neoprene's used in so many areas, from sneakers to cycling gloves to, Wellington boots to the car industry. It's used in buildings. So the neoprene industry is quite huge. And, and we're hearing about other areas where change is taking place. So decathletes, sailors, people who will be going to the Olympics will be wearing natural rubber. And I think that's really encouraging, because once the dominoes start to fall, certain, leisure and outdoor brands, they'll look at their footwear or their, the leisure wear that they produce and go, well, we need to examine our supply chains.
That was Chris Nelson, surfer, filmmaker, screenwriter and journalist, discussing his documentary The Big Sea, which is out this summer. Hello and welcome to the WGSN Create Tomorrow podcast. I'm your host, Bethan Ryder, editorial director at WGSN. And in this episode, we're diving into The Big Sea, a new 75-minute feature documentary that explores the connection between the $10 billion surfing industry and Cancer Alley in Louisiana in the US. This documentary reveals the toxic truth behind a single material, neoprene, and also throws a light on greenwashing. And we want to discuss this film because it demonstrates the crucial role that designers and brands can and must play in creating a better future for people and the planet. I'm delighted to welcome executive producer of the documentary, Chris Nelson, to the Create Tomorrow podcast. Hi, Chris.
Hi, Bethan. Thanks so much for inviting me on to talk about this.
Oh, it just sounds so interesting. I read the piece in The Guardian and thought we had to have you on. So thanks for joining us. I'd love to kick off by hearing how your brilliantly titled film, which I see what you did there with The Big Sea, came about. Now, you're a keen surfer, I believe, and I think you read an article yourself in The Guardian in 2015 about some findings by the US Environmental Protection Agency. Can you just row back to that and tell me a little bit about why you decided this was an important message that you had to make a film about?
Yes, so the film's collaboration between myself and another filmmaker, Lewis Arnold. And I think the story of Cancer Alley was covered in The Guardian and covered quite extensively. But I don't think anyone ever really made a connection between the story of Cancer Alley and specific products. And I think it was when Lewis and I joined the dots and talked about the fact that it was neoprene that was being produced, we found that really shocking, and we decided that we needed to collaborate on this and produce a documentary to highlight the fact that this story actually involved surfing and surfers, and that as surfers ourselves, we were complicit in this story.
I think we should explain to the listeners what the problem with neoprene is, right? So it's a synthetic rubber, which was first made in the 30s by DuPont chemists, and it's a polymer made from chloroprene, and 98% of wetsuits are made of it. So why is this material so nasty?
So chloroprene rubber actually was made to replace natural rubber because it was much more hard wearing. So it withstood the salt water and the light and doesn't biodegrade. So one of the things that makes it actually so harmful to the environment is one of the things that made it so useful for things like wetsuits. In the 1950s, a couple of surf brands discovered that chloroprene rubber foam makes a very good insulation that surfers could wear as wetsuits. And so it has become the, predominant material used in wetsuits ever since.
And most of the wetsuits are made from neoprene, which is made by a company called Denko. Is that correct?
Yes. So the Cancer Alley story revolves around a company called Denko, and Denko is the sole producer of chloroprene rubber in the US. And what happened was that in 2015, the EPA discovered that the cancer risk to the people living around the plant was 50 times the national average. So the people that lived there, for decades, they'd wondered why so many people had rare cancers, why there was such a high cancer risk. There were lots of cases of autoimmune disease, but they didn't really know why, and they suspected it was the plant, but really there was no evidence, and it wasn't until 2015 when the EPA came out with this report that they could specifically tie it to the plant.
And I think this is what one of the central themes of the film, which I think actually was the EPA that came up with this name, but environmental racism is one of the central themes of the film. And I think it's interesting because I must admit, surfing has such a sort of eco-friendly, laid-back, harmless pursuit in the environment. You talk to surfers, all surfers care about the oceans. Like, I don't know if you know Yves Bihar, he's been on the podcast, he's a designer. This has become a huge focus for anyone that is a surfer because they're seeing the plastic in the oceans. It's kind of like such a sort of industry that feels so right on, if you like, coming out of the 60s and all of this. But actually, there's this sort of direct connect between Cancer Alley. And I just think this environmental racism, for you, was that the key thing, this kind of like chasm between what you feel like the surfing community is about and what you care about and the harsh reality of this?
Yeah, I mean, I think somewhat naively, because we were so shocked by the story, we thought our initial response to this as filmmakers wasn't, let's make an expose where we can make a film and make the surf industry look really bad. So from the start, we engaged with the surf industry and we started talking to brands and we explained to them what we'd found out. And we started talking to people about their supply chains. And I think we thought what would happen was that the brands within the surf industry would be as shocked as we were. And yes, some of the brands were shocked and didn't really understand their supply chains. But what we found was there was a lot of inertia within some of the brands. They didn't really want to engage in the topic, and they certainly didn't want to think about how they could transition away from this kind of toxic carcinogenic material. So I think, yes, we found the topic to be very shocking, and it is shocking. And when you go and you talk to the people within the community, it's pretty heartbreaking, and you can't not be changed by that experience. But also, we were shocked by the fact that an industry that we thought was environmentally focused, there certainly are elements within it that are focused on the bottom line and didn't really want to make a move away from a traditional, very profitable kind of product line.
Yeah, I'm really interested. At the heart of this story is this environmental racism. Now, to be really frank, you're two white male surfers. How did you decide to tell this story, which is about predominantly African-American communities in the US? What decisions did you make in telling that narrative so that it was you treated it the right way?
Absolutely. I mean, that was the first conversation we had. So we sat down and we said, are we the right people to tell this story? We're two white surfers from the UK. This is a story about, a minority, a black community within the USA. How do we tell it? There's always the danger of it being like some sort of a white savior film. And so we approached this. We went, well, first of all, the community has to lead this. We have to use the language that the community uses. It's their story. We're giving the community a platform. And it's not like there were other people who were doing that. We kind of went, if nobody else is doing it, we have to do it, but we have to do it in the right way. And so the language we used was the language the community used. We discussed maybe bringing in a black presenter who could tell the story. But then we said, look, it's better that the community tells a story. So the way we've done it is there's no voiceover, we don't have a presenter. It's the lived experiences of the people within Cancer Alley and then talking to the surf community about their response.
So, Chris, tell me a little bit about Robert, one of the key protagonists of the film and a leading activist in this story.
Yeah, so all the activists, you kind of have to track back. So Robert, who's one of our main protagonists, Robert grew up before the civil rights era, and he lived in a time when his mother used to say to him, never look a white person in the eye. There was a danger of lynchings. He knew people who had been lynched, and he came through the civil rights era in the South. And Robert was pushed into a position where he had to take on a multinational petrochemical corporation, and he had no training in campaigning. So the people within the community are self-taught grassroots campaigners, and Robert and his fellow campaigners have managed to bring this to national attention. So really, Robert is one of our lead characters. His lived experience is kind of what drives the story. So yeah, he's experienced environmental racism. The Denker plant is actually built on a former slave plantation, and the area around the plant is land the descendants of the slaves were allowed to buy. they built parcels of land, they divided it up between their families, and this was going to be their forever land. So this was for their descendants. They knew that they could pass this down through the generations. And then what happened was the plants set up in Cancer Alley next to the communities, and the communities are being poisoned. And they cannot move away. It's not like they can sell their houses and move to a different area, because who wants to buy a house next to a petrochemical plant?
I mean, it sounds like the government should ideally step in and relocate everybody, but I also appreciate that people have strong communities and you can't just relocate people. They need to relocate with their community.
Well, I think one of the things that we discovered quite quickly was we're not going to get change through the federal system or the political system, because every time the federal government tried to do anything with Denka, it just gets tied up in the courts. So, the EPA hand down a judgment that says you have to clean up your emissions. Because one of the things you have to bear in mind is Denka aren't breaking any laws currently. The level of emissions that are going into the community are actually within the legal standard. So every now and again, the EPA will try and tighten that up and bring it right down to the 0.2 micrograms, which is the scientific level that has been recommended. But the EPA just take it to court on a local level, and if they lose, they appeal. So it can drag through the courts for decades. So I think that is why we thought our film might help, is because if we can bring consumer pressure to bear, that's the way that you can make a change that will actually help the communities in Cancer Alley.
And that's something, certainly at WGSN, we've written a lot about how increasingly consumers are losing any confidence in government and policy making, and that this is where brands can really play and can really change things and have an awful lot of power and influence. So this definitely seems like one of those situations. So I want to just talk a little bit about the positive things that are happening to kind of challenge this really awful situation. So the US brand Patagonia, which we constantly are writing about because it's such an incredible pioneer in many ways to do with sustainability, they developed something, an FSC certified natural bio rubber alternative called Ulex. So why is Ulex better? Can you tell us a little bit about that material?
So I think when Patagonia initially started to work with Ulex on this natural rubber, it was a little bit of an outlier. And I think Patagonia did it because they were looking at their carbon footprint. And it was before anyone was really aware about the link to, how toxic and what a horrible substance neoprene was, and the links to Cancer Alley. So they put a lot of time and effort working with Ulex to develop this natural rubber. And the thing is, it sounds ridiculously amazing in that it literally grows on trees. So you tap a rubber tree, you get the latex, you use that as your feedstock, and you blow it into like a rubber foam, and that becomes the material that you make the wetsuit from. So when we started to talk about this issue, we were like, the amazing thing about this is we're not just telling you this terrible thing is happening. There's also like a really amazing alternative that we could be switching to. So we were like, this is a no-brainer. So I think for us, the story is, yes, this is really depressing and it's a terrible thing that's happening, but also there is a really good natural alternative. So why aren't we making the change?
And I know that with wetsuits, obviously it's predominantly about it's a performance wear. So flexibility is important as a part of that. Presumably you're now in your Ulex. How does it perform? Are there any negatives to it in terms of the actual material for a surfer? Do you think it's it's just as good or better?
Yeah. So one of the things that we wanted to make sure we did with the film was our job wasn't to try and sell people on Ulex. We wanted to point out what was happening with Cancer Alley. However, we felt that Ulex is a really good alternative. And there are other brands of natural rubber coming online that are FSC certified and deforestation free certified. Performance-wise, we spoke to the brands because I wear natural rubber wetsuits and I think they're great. I think they're just as stretchy, just as warm. Price-wise, they're very comparable now, very competitive. But obviously, it's not our job to tell people that. We wanted to hear it from the brands, and also some of the brands that have traditionally been, wholesale neoprene dependent. And the brands will tell you that, natural rubber wetsuits are as warm as flexible as, price-wise, competitive as a neoprene wetsuit.
And I understand that Patagonia and Ulex shared their knowledge. It's almost like open source. They shared their sort of technology as well, which is something I think everyone needs to do more and more if we're going to solve these issues. And Finisterre has followed. It's another brand that's followed suit in 2021. I read that Billabong has a line. Excel is promising to be neoprene free by 2026. So it feels like there's a wave happening of change.
Absolutely. And I think, as each brand starts to transition, it knocks down some of the, barriers that were supposedly there. So one of the things we encountered early on was some of the brands said, look, the majority of our range is for the more price conscious consumer. But what we've seen, like yesterday, Decathlon announced that they are doing all their children's wetsuits are going to be in what's called Ulex 100, which is 100% natural rubber. Some of their tops are going to be Ulex, and they're going to be transitioning into, wholly Ulex over time. And, Decathlon is aimed at the more price conscious end of the market.
Yeah, that's incredible news. Actually, Chris, we're launching a new product this summer, Sports and Outdoor. And it's exactly these topics we'll be exploring around sports such as surfing, cycling, hiking, fitness. And we'll be advising clients on how to navigate these crucial things such as sustainability, forthcoming legislation and certifications, not to mention throwing spotlights on exciting new materials.
Yeah, and I think just to segue slightly, I think one of the things that we found while we were talking to brands is the amount of greenwashing that takes place within the surf industry, which we found very shocking. I think a lot of surfers thought for years they've been buying green products. And when you delve into that, you find that they're actually not green. In fact, some of them are actually quite toxic. And I think that really impacted how slow the transition has been within, wetsuits. Because one of the things was, traditionally everything was made of petrochemical chloroprene rubber, petrochemical neoprene. And then a new substance came along called so-called limestone neoprene, which was made by, you quarry limestone from the ground, you use that as a carbon source. It's melted in the furnace to create chloroprene and then is made into a wetsuit. So it's a very energy intensive, quite a toxic way of doing it. But because the material that it comes from is limestone, they say, well, it's made from minerals and it's sustainable because there's a lot of limestone, but ultimately you're just mining a carbon source from the ground and it's very energy intensive. But that was sold, and some brands are still selling it as eco-sustainable, green, so surfing really has to look at the way it is selling its products, because the more you look at it, the more surfing has become a poster child for greenwashing, because almost every kind of greenwashing that you can imagine is taking place within the surf industry.
So, Chris, there might be people listening that already have a neoprene wetsuit. What do you advise? What should people do with these? Just carry on wearing them? What's your advice?
Yeah, so obviously, Lewis and I and everybody we know who heard about the story was quite shocked, and we immediately switched to Ulex. However, I think our advice to people would be keep wearing your neoprene wetsuit. You can get them repaired as well. There are a number of places in the UK, in Europe, in America that will repair your wetsuit, and you can actually get the repairs done in natural rubber. So keep wearing the wetsuits, keep getting them repaired. But when they do come to end of life, there are ways to recycle them. I think there are a couple of brands coming on stream now that offer recycling. And also that's the time to make the move to natural rubber. Don't just immediately throw them away and make a change, because you're just adding to landfill and waste, but keep using them, keep repairing them, and then when the time comes, make a positive change. I think for the brand athletes themselves, it's quite difficult because a lot of them are tied to brands. They have sponsorship deals, and while you talk to some of them and they maybe are open to change, they need the brands to actually lead that change so they can come out vocally and respond and speak out.
And there are other categories where this is a relevant thing, not just surfing, right?
Yeah, and I think that was one of the things with the film, because we went, surfing is something that everybody can engage with. People don't want to watch a documentary about cancer and about Cancer Alley, but they'll watch a documentary about surfing and how surfing relates to Cancer Alley. But surfing really is the first domino in that neoprene's used in so many areas, from sneakers to cycling gloves to, Wellington boots to the car industry. It's used in buildings. So the neoprene industry is quite huge. And we're hearing about other areas where change is taking place. So decathletes, sailors, people who will be going to the Olympics will be wearing natural rubber. And I think that's really encouraging, because once the dominoes start to fall, then, maybe car manufacturers who hear about this story and they go, well, we need to be environmental, then they'll make the change. Certain, leisure and outdoor brands, they'll look at their footwear or their, the leisure wear that they produce and go, well, we need to examine our supply chains.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because the Olympics itself could have a huge influence here as well. We work with Copenhagen Fashion Week, who are having a huge influence in their rules that they're setting for the brands that even show at their Fashion Week. Imagine if the Olympics declared themselves neoprene free in 4 years' time or something. I mean, that would be amazing, wouldn't it?
It would, and I think that was one of the things we hoped. We thought, well, maybe what will happen is the World Surf League, which is it's a bit like, if you think about Formula One, and they have the Formula One circuit, goes to many places around the world. The WSL Tour is the equivalent. We thought, well, imagine if the WSL said, we're going to be neoprene free, that athletes taking part in the competitions would be wearing natural rubber. What an amazing stance that would be.
Yeah. Exactly. So to wrap up, where can people see your film? What's happening this summer? Where can they look out for it?
Yeah, so we're going to be rolling the film out. We're going to be doing festival screenings around the world. So we'll be starting with the UK, and then we'll be rolling out across the UK, across Europe, across the US, Australia. We'll also be doing some film tours as well. So from the summer onwards, people will be able to watch the film, and then hopefully we'll be getting it onto a platform to be able to share it with everybody.
Thank you so much, Chris Nelson, for joining us and for highlighting this serious issue. And you can find out more about the film at The Big C, and that's SEA, thebigc.org. If you're a WGSN subscriber, look out for our sports and outdoor launch this summer, where you'll find a wealth of forecasts covering this industry. If you're not a WGSN subscriber, then head over to WGSN.com to discover how to subscribe to our services. We're constantly publishing new content focusing on how we can design a brighter, better future for all of our industries. And these include food and drink, interiors, fashion, beauty, consumer tech, and the forthcoming sports and outdoor. We'll be back in 2 weeks for our next episode. In the meantime, you can catch the CEO of WGSN, Carly Buzashi, next week on our other podcast, Lives of Tomorrow. Until next time, look out for the Big C this summer.